Okay. I don't have any slides, but I'm going to talk about ecclesiology some more right now. And specifically, ecclesiology being the study of the church, within a Christian context. Specifically, I'm asking the question of not just which church is the true church, but sort of how can we know which church is the true church? Because I think that it's a very frustrating topic for many people, because many people will take Jesus Christ seriously. Indeed, view him as having infinite importance in their lives and everyone else's, but they don't know which church is the true church, because it seems like you need to study all these books and know all these languages, and even people with credentials and seemingly very high IQs, they can't all agree. And so it's a bunch of videos and debates, some of which are hard to follow, and it can be very frustrating. And really the sense that I have when I kind of survey the landscape of different cases for different churches is, while some may strike me as more plausible than others, I just can't know, for example, that, Presbyterianism is false. I'm Catholic. I converted to the Catholic Church, not based on any particular study of doctrine, though. I was led to the Catholic Church more so through experiences that happened within a relatively short, well, actually not so short time frame, some of which only really made sense in retrospect. But, I'm Catholic, but I don't know that Presbyterianism is false. If one wanted to say that basically the early church had already lost the plot on certain doctrines, or it took them a while to figure out certain other doctrines. Like, for example, if they lost the plot as far as the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and then it took them a while. It took until Augustine to understand predestination. Well, I mean, I guess that seems unlikely to me, but in the end of the day, do I know that? I mean, something like the Trinity, that God is three persons in one being, it also seems unlikely to me. I wouldn't have known about it until someone told me. I wouldn't believe it if everyone believed it, or perhaps unless I just deeply studied the matter and came to the same conclusion myself. But that it's certainly not the case that studying theology, even as intensely as one can, and seemingly in as much good faith as one wants to, and even for your whole life, it doesn't like necessarily produce agreement. In particular, there doesn't really appear to be any set of facts that someone can lay out, awareness of which results in people of good faith who are able to comprehend those facts, or wrap their minds around those facts, all agreeing on what they mean. So if I was to say there is this minimal facts case for Presbyterianism, again, something like that, and if you understand these, then you know that Presbyterianism is true. Probably, while some very smart and well-meaning Presbyterians might say, yeah, this is definitive, some Eastern Orthodox people, some Catholic people, even just some Methodist or Baptist people will look at it and say, no, I don't think these things mean that the Presbyterian Church is the true church, which tells me, as an amateur philosopher, that these facts aren't really sufficient for knowledge, not as laid out. I'm going to sort of impute, or they probably aren't. I'm not going to impute. Well, even so, I mean, I would say that at a minimum, the case has to be unpacked more. It's too compressed. Certain suppressed premises have to be unpacked. And until then, well-meaning people will draw different conclusions despite being able to comprehend all the facts in question. And that, as long as that is the case, I mean, unless we impute bad faith or intellectual dishonesty to those who do seem to understand all the facts but disagree as to their meaning, I would just tend to think that these facts aren't enough. That's what it means. They aren't enough for justified true belief. And so, we're, again, as compared to the past, we're in sort of a lamentable position that in the past, there was only one church. And there may have been there may have been doctrinal disagreements at those times. But looking in hindsight, we moderns are now all agreed that that one church in the beginning was the true church. And, though there may have been disagreements within them, they were not such as to justify the breaking of communion, at least not until certain doctrines were formally defined, through ecumenical councils. So, back then there was one church, but we can't just go back to the beliefs of the early church in 80 AD or 100 AD or in 180 AD or at Nicaea, for example, because even if we just say, yeah, we ascribe to all these beliefs, we believe all these beliefs, we subscribe to them all. Well, the problem is that in the almost 2,000 years, since the Council of Nicaea, there has been many questions that have been raised that have forced us to have to clarify doctrine, or develop doctrine, or whatever language you want to use. We can't really go back to the past. We can't unhear the questions that have been raised. We can't forget them. They can't be unasked. They demand answers, and sort of, as far as I can tell, the only method that I can think of that would be sort of guaranteed to produce the true church, guaranteed to let you land on the true church, that is 100% doctrinal accuracy, would be something like if you start at the beginning, and then every time a question sort of gets raised, at least in public, of a question that we know about, arises in history, and people disagree over it, and the church ramifies over it. They split off into two or more groups as a result of whatever disagreement. We have to sort of go through history, and at each point obtain the right answer to each doctrinal question that gets raised, that forced the church to clarify doctrine. And then if we do that and we move through history and get the right answer to every single one, then we should be good, at least given some assumption on which the church is indefectible in a way where she will always be 100% right on all doctrines, which is, again, it's an assumption that we're not forced to make. It is possible that at some point all Christian churches could have lost the plot. It's hard then to say what it would mean that the gates of hell won't prevail against the church. But then again, as a Catholic, I find basically all non-Catholic interpretations of Matthew 16 to be somewhat strained, because if taken, the gates of hell won't prevail. You're Peter, you are Peter. On this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell won't prevail against it. If taken as a reference to, yeah, the church that won't succumb to error, but it's not the church that is based on Peter or his successors, then it's just really saying that the true church will always be the true church, but it doesn't really help because you don't know which one that is. But maybe at a minimum we can take that as saying that the church will have gotten all questions right. But again, we're not forced to that assumption. And even I think if one takes Protestantism seriously and doesn't beg the question against it, then one understands that Protestantism is sort of committed to the idea that for certain periods, there are certain periods of history where basically everybody lost the plot to some degree or other. And that, semper reformanda, the doctrine, we may say is still developing, if we put it like that, except it sort of looks more like, instead of less refined views becoming more refined over time, it sort of looks like the church is correcting errors. So I mean, there's that caveat, but Protestantism as a phenomenon to me seems committed to some version of this view, which I will call defectibilism, and the view that the church there will always be at least one church that's right on every question. I'll call that indefectibilism. Anyway, whether or not in history the right answer was obtained to those questions at the time they were raised is actually sort of irrelevant, because it may be that I, the person who is trying to recreate all true doctrine for myself, de novo, is the only person who will get the right answer to all these questions, given some assumption of defectibilism. That is to say, I can assume that even if every Christian lost the plot at some point, that doesn't necessarily mean that I will. I can sort of go through and theoretically obtain the correct answer to every question that gets raised about doctrinal matters over the course of history. So again, in theory, this is a method that should work. One thing that we notice is that if Catholicism is true, then at every such branching point in history, nobody really needs any theological smarts. All they have to do is obey the highest church authority of the church that they are part of. And then they'll always be in the truth. Now, granted, they may not really know that they're in the truth, but they will, as a matter of fact, be in the truth. And there are, one assumes, certain benefits to being in the church that has, all the true doctrines and the true practices. And if there are not, the whole subject is sort of moot. We don't need to discuss it. And so in Catholicism, there's a sort of way where you don't really need a brain to remain in the truth. Whereas if you take any other flavor of Christianity, there's going to be some theological discernment you would have to exercise, sort of as this Christian time traveler who sort of started from the early church and then was just kind of living forever, implausibly but hypothetically, through every age, and then always deciding at each point in church history who was right and who was wrong, and which church is the true church, and which ship to jump out on as the previous ship sinks. Because if Catholicism is not true, then certainly you're committed to some version of that, where basically some ship is sinking, and one has to bail out and get on a different ship. And I want to bring attention to the fact that there is a certain crucial way in which the church breaks on this view. There is a church, what can really only strike one as a church failure. And the reason why is that you now no longer have the luxury of just submitting. You have to use your brain in order to remain in the right church. And the problem with that is, as we have seen, thinking for yourself is not a method that produces, very much agreement. And I would really go as far as to say that theology as a whole strikes me as so inconspicuous that there's basically no, as far as I can tell, real relationship between the effort one puts in and the accuracy of one's resulting theological guess. And that's a big statement, but here's what I mean by it. At least if again you're taking the sort of challenge of being able to put forward a set of minimal facts, as it were, as a serious challenge, then I'm not aware of any one set of facts that I could get, all Christians who have such and such a degree, if I could get all Christians with a doctorate, would they all agree on these facts? If I could get all Christians with an IQ of 130 or above, would they all agree on these facts? If I could get all Christians who have 10 or more years of theological study under their belt, regardless of their day job, would I get agreement on these facts? I wouldn't. And what that means is that at a minimum, even if there is like a subset of Christians who are looking at those facts and they are interpreting it correctly, and they sort of have justified true belief from those facts, but the reason why everybody else doesn't agree is that basically the case still needs to be unpacked more, and more suppressed premises have to be brought out. It's too compressed. It has to be expanded or expanded upon. Well, regardless, it's only a small minority at most of those people who are really coming away with justified true belief from that hypothetical set of minimal facts. And I mean specifically one that proves a non-Catholic church to be the true church. Because if it happens that there is like this determinate or decisive set of theological facts, but it proves the Catholic Church true, then there's certainly no downside to sort of having provisionally committed to Catholicism out of a posture of provisional theological skepticism, which is what I'm sort of so far arguing for. It's at most a minority. I would think no more than 5 or certainly 10%, but really a lot less than that, because again, there's just that. Whatever I say the qualifications are, maybe I make it all about holiness. The holiest seeming people will agree which church is the true church. They don't, at least not to me. Or the people with the most developed sensitivity to beauty will somehow use the beauty of the true church as this sort of indicator of its veracity as the true church. I don't really clearly see agreement among, like, let's say the most aesthetically sensitive or aesthetically knowledgeable Christians. Again, it possibly one could find a correlation among the top 10 or 5 or 1% that one is saying is capable of seeing the true church with some measure of determinacy, or they're able to have justified true belief in the true church from some minimal set of facts. But I don't think there is one. I'm not aware that there is one, and then sort of until I see one, I think that does suggest that I am justified in my sort of a provisional attitude of skepticism. In other words, if it's not the case that even among the 1% or 0.1% of most educated, intelligent Christians, if we don't observe a pattern as far as which church they end up in, and again, specifically non-Catholic, because if it turns out that there's a clear sort of relationship between education and intelligence and being Catholic, then it does mean there's not a downside to having been Catholic or to having provisionally adopted Catholicism, as a response to, or as an expression of theological skepticism. If there's not this real clear correlation, what that tells me is that it's possible nobody is really coming away with justified true belief from whatever hypothetical minimal set of facts we are supposing grants one knowledge of the true church. It could be that there is somebody who's looking at the facts and really grokking them and really understanding why they lead to Presbyterianism or Eastern Orthodoxy or something like that. But I would think that this is like 1 in a million people. This is like your chances of figuring it out. It would be the case that theology is so confusing that it's like trying to win the lottery or something like that, where you can't really try to win the lottery, especially if you can only buy like one ticket. There's not really going to be a relationship between effort and accuracy in that case. And what it would mean is, either Catholicism is true or there is some non-Catholic church that is the true church. But the only way one could know it is if one was like extremely talented or lucky or rare, and one's chances of otherwise finding it, by chance, were basically equivalent to winning the lottery. And that means that there's basically no implication for action from non-Catholicism. It's you might as well just be Catholic. It would be a sort of a dominant strategy, because if Catholicism is not true, nothing you really do matters anyway. You're just guessing. So, I mean, of course, one doesn't have to be moved in the direction of theological skepticism like I've been doing. You can say that there's an easy way to see for oneself that to do the theological math, and you'll just be forced to the conclusion, if you're intellectually honest, that such and such church is the true church. But I have yet to see that set of minimal facts where I must assume that whoever reaches a different conclusion is in bad faith. You might assume that, but if for me the truth of whatever denomination, fundamentalist independent baptism or something, if the truth of that depends on my having to assume that people who look at the same biblical verses and come away with a different theological picture are in bad faith, then I'm just not going to believe in whatever it is, fundamentalist independent baptism, because I don't think that those people are in bad faith. So again, there does seem to be a critical way in which the church breaks on anything except Catholicism, because if Catholicism is not true, then the only way that one finds the true church reliably is through personal theological acumen, which was not the case up until whatever theological debate precipitated the first error. So, if you're not Catholic, you're going to believe there is this point where the first error got introduced into mainstream theology, and at that point the primatial leader of the church, even if he was just primary in terms of honor only, he fumbled and he got it wrong. And then at that point, just submitting to the highest church authority, honorary or otherwise, is not going to buy you knowledge. So there was a way that staying in the truth was sort of brainless and effortless before this moment of failure, but it becomes a matter of personal theological acumen afterward. And then we're just fundamentally in a different boat, because everybody is sort of having to judge for themselves. They know that the true church is out there somewhere, but they don't know which one it is. And their guess as to which one it is rests on the strength of certain assumptions which They don't have any sort of infallible ability to check the accuracy of. They have only their own fallible reasoning on which to base those assumptions, on which to vet those assumptions, on which to prop up or discard those assumptions. And so that looks like a great failure, because again, it would be like previously there was this reliable way of staying in the truth or finding it, which was that reliable in the sense that it always produced the outcome that you wanted, regardless of actually whether or not you have justified true belief in the proposition that communion with the Bishop of Rome will ensure that one is always in the right communion or in the true church. It is just working regardless of whether you realize it is working. It also has what you would call high inter-rater reliability, in the sense that there's typically not disagreement over who the Bishop of Rome is. There are, of course, periods in history in which there was, to which I can only point out right now that they are notable because it's not really clear to me that doctrine really differed between the different papal candidates back then. And so while it's regrettable from a Catholic point of view, if one takes the cash value of communion with the Bishop of Rome as sort of guaranteeing that you're in the true church, and the cash value of being in the true church as being in the church with the right beliefs and the right practices, it's not clear to me that the beliefs and practices of any of the churches of the different papal candidates really differed from each other beyond that simple question of who the Pope is. So while those events in history they are sort of a notable counterexample to what I'm talking about, I don't know that in the end they spell any kind of theological doom for Catholicism or for the kind of argument that I am making here. So yeah, again, it feels like something breaks. Something is working up until a certain point, and then it breaks on non-Catholicism, whereas on Catholicism there's a certain way where you just never need to use your brain. And so, for a person in our present day to look at the landscape of churches and decide which one is the most true, if you think that, well, gee, I'm just really not qualified to do that, and I doubt that I can, but I do think that God will have made a way for us to always find the true church reliably, then I'm going to choose to be in communion with the Bishop of Rome, because one can understand that voting for that bishop is basically going with the proposition that all I know is that I know nothing. It's almost like it would be to say that one doesn't believe God set it up in such a way that one doesn't believe God set it up in such a way that it would depend on personal theological acumen or discernment at all, even though that judgment is itself notably a kind of second order or reflexive, theological opinion or judgment. But granted, one has to recognize that that's a different kind of judgment than is the judgment of saying, I know some things, I know many things, I know all things. To say that I know nothing is a different kind of judgment. Just like in Proverbs 3:6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, acknowledge him in all your ways, and he will direct your paths. If someone said, well, that's a silly proverb because one leans on one's own understanding even when one decides not to lean on one's own understanding, that person would be missing the point. The point of the proverb is not that there is this way of submitting that avoids all conceivable charges of self-referential inconsistency. That's not really what it's saying. As long as there is a meaningful distinction between, say, submitting to an authority, on all sort of matters in a certain category, and then not necessarily submitting on all of the matters in all the category in that category, but reserving the right to not submit based on whether or not one feels that one would like to do something else, in a particular case, or when it comes to a particular topic, in that category, those are just two different things. So a response which just sort of glosses over the distinction between what are like meaningfully distinct categories is not always going to be an on-target response. And I would say it's the same thing. I would say that when it comes to theology, which is not so very clear as a field, certainly not so clear as to produce like the kind of interpersonal agreement that we would wish for. If someone says, well, you know what, I don't really understand these data, and yet this is a very important matter, therefore, I'm just going to assume that God made a way for people to find it that would be independent of their own sort of theological discernment. Yes, granted, that is an act of theological discernment, but it's equivalent to saying, I know that I know, I know that I don't know, as opposed to saying, well, I'm pretty sure. Like, I feel competent to do this. I'm going to bet on myself. I think in general, people are competent to rule when they do not know something. If in a physics class, somebody is struggling and saying, gee, I don't really understand any of this, someone would be silly to tell them that, well, you must understand something, because you clearly understand that you don't understand anything, so that means you do understand something, so you're just blowing smoke. That's a weird response. People are able to know when they know nothing. So there is a way that the church does seem to fail on non-Catholicism. But there, one could also simply say that, by way of objection to me, that obviously most people don't think about the question in the way that I have presented so far. They don't take it in this sort of direction, and so they might say, well, basically it might be objected that theology could be so conceivably so hard to figure out that most, if not all, people really never succeed in figuring out, that most, if not all, people can't figure theology out. In other words, it's so hard to figure out that most people don't even know that they can't figure it out. It's like the Dunning-Kruger effect or something like that. And so if that is the case, then we're really in a kind of dynamic situation where there's no, to use the language of self-reference that Bertrand Russell, I think, gave us. He talked about paradoxes where, like, does the barber who shave all the barbers who don't shave themselves shave himself, or does he not shave himself? Because if he does, then he doesn't, and if he doesn't, then he does, etc. So there are weird things that happen with self-referential descriptions, and then when you use language of orders of reference, like first order, second order, then it can potentially clarify things. So I've been arguing that there's not really, in effect, to use, I think, Russell's language, I don't know whose, really, but it's pretty standard. In effect, I've been arguing that if there is no decisive first order theological case for any one church, Catholicism accepted, then that itself sort of represents a decisive second order theological case, or case about cases, or absence thereof. in favor of Catholicism again. If one said that, well, theology is actually so hard that most reasonable people can't even realize that they don't understand it, then we're really in this dynamic place where there's neither a decisive first order case nor a decisive second order one. And that would be a kind of a defeater for my argument if that could be proven. But, I'm not really too sure it can, because when I think about it, I ask myself, let's suppose that Catholicism is true, but, that there is still hypothetically just no reliable way of finding the true church for anyone. That the minimal set of facts that I've been putting out here, fails the very test that I'm saying, should be put to every set of minimal facts, where basically you should be able to get agreement among people of good faith who are also sufficiently intelligent as to comprehend all the facts that are in view. And if you can't, then that means it's not really sufficient for knowledge. It's not really like a decisive case. Let's suppose that my argument thus far is failing that test, because it's actually, theology is just so hard to figure out that most people can't even really figure out that they can't figure it out. All right. Well, then, because what I've been doing this whole time is I've been resting on the assumption that God's omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence are such that, we would actually expect there to be a way for all people, or at least a majority of people, to reliably find the true church. But even barring that, it will at least not be the case that only a minority of people can reliably find the true church. That's basically a suppressed premise that I've been operating on. And you can doubt it, but what it means is that, if this is only possibly true on Catholicism, then any non-Catholic case is sort of necessarily going to have to demonstrate plausibility higher than that assumption, which is a pretty good assumption, especially if it turns out that theology is it is so inconspicuous that there's really no correlation between sort of the most knowledgeable people and what churches they choose, so that one in the end would not be unjustified in supposing that everyone is basically guessing, and one might as well just guess. And so there's a sort of way where, if one does not assume that there is a reliable way to find the true church for more than just a tiny minority of people, then one might as well give up any realistic hope of finding it, because it's not very humble or very realistic necessarily to then make that assumption and then just automatically suppose that one is going to be in that favored minority. Is neither necessarily very realistic nor very humble. But anyway, let's say that I'm wrong about everything, that this is truly topsy-turvy, and there's no decisive case at all, which means there isn't one, which means there is one, which means there isn't one, which means there is, etc. Would I, on this picture, now assuming that Catholicism is true, if Catholicism was true nevertheless all along, would I be able to say that there is no reliable way for the true church to be found? I'm not so sure, because, if I die and I go to heaven, and I wasn't Catholic, but it turns out Catholicism is true, and I say, well, gee, there wasn't really a reliable way to find the true church. They might say, well, whichever angel or whoever, St. Peter is talking to me, he might say, well, did you ever think that the whole business was so difficult that you ought to just look for an infallible guide to theology or something like that? Did you ever think that this business is so difficult that, one ought to look for the hand of God somewhere. And, it's kind of, if I assumed that I knew more than I did, it's hard to defend against the possibility of a kind of hubris in that. There's also a way where, like it says, where does it say this in Hebrews? I can't remember, but, whatever is not from faith is sin. If I did look at the theological landscape and say, gee, this is really confusing, I don't know up or down, I listened to some person's presentation where he said that if you can't figure it out, that means you should assume Catholicism is true. But, gee, I don't even really know if that's true. But I then don't assume that God has made any provision for me to find the true church in the midst of my ignorance, which he sees. Is that not a kind of unbelief? Because in Catholicism, it's going to say, well, regardless of whether or not you can figure it out, God is going to have set down a flag or a tag on the true church, and you'll always be able to find it. And the sooner you realize you don't figure it out, the sooner you can go looking for the thing that is going to advertise the sort of divine assistance in this matter. If the angel told me that, I don't know if I would have a ready defense, because it would seem like all along I had been in a kind of bad faith. But then again, with bad faith, I recognize that so in other words, I'm not so sure that if Catholicism is true, we could not say that there was always some reliable way of finding the true church. Because what was God otherwise supposed to do? Was he other than what he did, was he supposed to make theology easy? Can you make something easy can you make a subject easy without actually changing the subject material? Can I make physics easy without changing the laws of physics? I can try to simplify, but that's not really I can't necessarily make it any easier beyond a certain point. And theology comes from God could change physics, but to the extent that theology flows from God's own immutable nature, theology is truly unchangeable. Its difficulty is more or less fixed, we may suppose. I suppose maybe God could have made everyone 30 IQ points smarter, which might have helped or might not, given the reality of our present situation. But assuming he has whatever good reasons for not doing that, that he has, he's not going to do that. So yeah, I'm not really sure if we assume Catholicism is true that we can really plausibly maintain that there was never a reliable way to find the true church, because you could just look at this confusing situation, admit that you're confused, but then trust that God would have made some way of guiding you. And maybe you've never thought about the question in this way until now, but there is going to be a certain way in which, like Hegel always said, to know a limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit. Having heard this presentation, it may now be that you're in bad faith unless you sort of lean into, whatever thing I may have said that may have struck you as, more plausible than you would have thought it to be, heading into this video. It seems like if we are to take there's Catholicism, there's non-Catholicism. Let's say God didn't fail us. His omniscience was such that there was always a way to find the true church reliably. But on non-Catholicism, what that means is you have to figure out sort of the raw facts of theology from the sources of revelation and figure out where they point to. And that appears to be a challenge which only a very few people can do, unless we suppose that everybody who's looking at whatever hypothetical minimal facts case we are saying demonstrates the truth of X, Y, or Z, is actually in bad faith. And it's actually rather easy. I mean, certain Christians talk this way, but I don't tend to believe that. It could be true. I mean, if you're in bad faith, you have to be able to tell on some level. You know, it can't be that only God can judge if someone is in bad faith, because the whole point of being in bad faith is you should have been able to tell. You were suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, and only each person can really make that determination, prior to the judgment day, at least. On Catholicism, you could say everybody else was sort of in bad faith too, and I find the charge more plausible. It more plausibly sticks, where it's like, yeah, they were in bad faith because they assumed they knew more than they did. They thought they knew it all. They thought they didn't need my guidance, or they thought I wouldn't provide, even though they admitted they didn't know what was going on. Whatever's not from faith is sin. That I wouldn't like to hear those words on Judgment Day. I would rather hear you weren't smart enough to figure it out, but hey, you know what? Things kind of went awry. It wasn't really God's plan for the primatial leader of the church to fall into error, but after he did, it did become a matter of everybody relying on their personal theological acumen. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. It wasn't God's fault. It was just his permissive will. He's still going to bring some kind of good out of it. You'll see. I would much rather hear that than hear, no, your problem was that you assumed you knew it all and that you didn't need God's guidance, and or that he wouldn't provide guidance even if you did need it. So there's that sort of meaningful difference between Catholicism and the negation of Catholicism. So yeah, I think that that's gonna more or less cover what I wanted to say in this video. There's always more. I mean, for people who have listened to my two presentations, The True Church and the Not Easiness of Theology Part 1, and The True Church and the Not Easiness of Theology Part 2, ingeniously named, it was really just me talking for 4 hours in one stretch, but I hit the stop button more or less by accident in the middle, and I didn't feel like spicing them back together. I don't really know how to do that. So, but for people who have listened to that, they'll hear many of the same themes sounded again in this presentation. It's basically the same presentation. It's what I'll call my disjunctive argument for Catholicism, because you don't necessarily know which church is the true church, but you do know that either Catholicism or not Catholicism. And if not Catholicism, that means that in order to find the true church, you're sort of reliant on personal theological acumen in a way that you just are not, if Catholicism is true. And that if we assume that God's omniness is such that he has at least not allowed such a negative development to happen as there only being a reliable way to find the true church for just a tiny few people. If we assume that cannot happen, then we see that only Catholicism is compatible logically with that assumption, because I think really when we see how much disagreement there is among people of good faith on theological questions, they can have whatever credentials, they can have whatever IQ, they can have had however many years of experience or study. It just doesn't look like personal theological acumen is a very reliable way to find the true church, either in terms of like arriving at the destination reliably, or in terms of producing inter-rater reliability, which is of course related, to say the least. Let me see. What I'm saying is that any non-Catholic case, it has to exceed in plausibility. the plausibility of whatever non-Catholic case we are making, it has to be greater than the plausibility of the idea that God's omniness is such that he wouldn't allow it to be the case that only a tiny minority of people can find the true church reliably. However plausible we may make that assumption, or however plausible we may think that assumption is just going in a priori, the non-Catholic case has to basically be, as far as I can tell, it has to be more plausible than that. And until one finds a case that clearly is more plausible than that, one is justified in sort of provisionally adopting Catholicism. Sort of like based on the epistemology of, I'm not going to just only believe what I can definitively prove, because no one can really definitively prove anything. I can't really prove that I'm not just a brain in a vat, for example, but I will believe something until I have reason not to believe it. And so I'll believe Catholicism until I see this like clear non-Catholic case that just forces me to the conclusion that some other church besides the Catholic one is correct. I'm not really aware of one. I mean, if I was doing straight theology, Eastern Orthodoxy would be my sort of runner-up. But when it comes to the Filioque, that's for me where you run into trouble. Because, I mean, like Maximus's letter, which is normally held to be inconvenient for Catholics, I don't know how that's really possible with any how that's how that can support, the non-Catholic case, if I can just digress on this topic for a second, because, he's Maximus in that letter is saying that the Latin fathers are unanimous. What are they unanimous about? Surely it must be, the Filioque, unless one can produce this list of Latin fathers that are unanimous against it, which I wouldn't even know exists. And so Maximus doesn't see a problem in the way that they are understanding the issue. And that means either Maximus doesn't understand what they are saying despite being a theological genius, or he is the refrain from the Orthodox side is that etia is only ever used of the Father, and therefore the Son cannot have a kind of mediatory role in the production of the Holy Spirit. But the way that the Catholic would read that is that etia refers to the font or ultimate source of causation, which nobody disputes that the Father is. But that doesn't mean the Son can't have a kind of secondary or proximate causal role. Unless one sort of assumes that Maximus is reading the Fathers that way and understanding etia as just referring to the ultimate cause and not barring the possibility that the Son could have a mediatory role in the production of the Holy Spirit. I don't really know how to make sense of the letter unless we just suppose that Maximus didn't know what was going on despite being a theological genius. That's just one inconvenient fact. There are more, but these facts for me cast doubt on the thesis that Eastern Orthodoxy somehow got most or all of theology correct. And it seems to me that there's this critical sense in which Catholicism is the default. There's a burden of proof that has to be met on the other side, a burden of proof of plausibility equal to the proposition that God's omniness is such that it will at least not be the case that only a tiny minority of people can find the true church reliably. And until some case can clearly exceed that, I think one is justified in being Catholic and sticking to being Catholic. And even if it were to be that such a case will emerge in the future, it will still have to clear the hurdle of their how to put it. Even if you say that there was just a long period of time for which there was no reliable way to find the true church, that's also sort of inherently implausible. It's a priori implausible. That's a hurdle that has to be cleared. And really, again, for me, theology is not so determinate that any case can clearly cross any bar at the end of the day, except the one that says, like if it's determinate that it's more or less this indeterminate, then that would seem to have certain definite implications. The only thing that's clear about theology to me is that it's relatively unclear. I can basically, it's like this. One way to express it would be like, I don't see how certain premises necessarily yield certain conclusions. That's one way to say it. Another way to say it would be to say that it seems to me like pretty much any case could be said to yield the conclusion that it is held to yield. I can prove more or less any theological position from the theological data. I can pretend that I am a Presbyterian apologist, an Orthodox apologist, and look at the data in a certain way that yields, a Presbyterianism or Orthodoxy. And at the end of the day, I wouldn't even know that position was wrong. I might think that there's a certain other more plausible interpretation of the data, but I wouldn't ever know that their position was wrong. And so theology is quite indeterminate. And I'm not really sure that, again, that anything really necessarily, as far as we can see, it yields, a given conclusion. But I do see that the motivation to believe in something like the proposition that God's omniscience is such that it will not be the case that only a tiny minority of people can find the true church reliably. Let's call that, in my notes I call that O star. I can see that the motivation for a proposition like O star can be sort of raised seemingly without limit the more important that one supposes theology to be. I talked about this in my 4-hour presentation, The True Church and the Not Easiness of Theology, which again is kind of a funny title, but and it was basically like a thought experiment where we had 3 warehouses and almost like a reality TV style challenge where like 20 or so people, different groups of people in each case, show up to each warehouse and they're given a task. In the first warehouse, the task is they have to make a sculpture, and every person sort of does their best at it. But at the end of the day, there's no constraints on it. Like there's no really wrong way to do art. They just have to make a sculpture that expresses something personal or something that's inside them. And if in that condition, some person said, I have a special relationship with the warehouse owner or with like the TV show producers, where if I ever start making my sculpture wrong in any way, they flash me this discreet warning that only I can really see. And so that means if you copy my sculpture exactly, you're guaranteed to not make a wrong sculpture. A person who said something like that in the group would be rightly dismissed as not knowing what he was talking about and not trustworthy, because there's no really wrong way to do art. So this is corresponding to the condition in which theology is neither difficult nor important, or theological accuracy is not important, let's say. Now, in the next case, we can suppose that in 20 people show up to a warehouse, the task is to build a boat. All the boat has to do is float. It can just be paddled over a lake. Somebody says, I have a special relationship with the warehouse owner, who gave us all these supplies out of which to make these boats and the instructions to follow it and so on. If I ever start making my boat wrong, he'll flash me a discreet signal that only I can see. Well, if the other people ignore him or don't find him totally trustworthy and just decide to make their own boats, they might not be wrong to do that, because at the end of the day, how hard is it to make a boat that floats? This is corresponding to the case where theology is it is important. Accuracy is important. The seaworthiness of the boat is important, but it's not necessarily difficult. So, but in the third case where like the goal is to create some kind of novel aircraft out of these parts that nobody really understands, like I'm reminded of a movie that Mystery Science Theater 3000 made fun of. It was called This Island Earth. And the main character has to build a strange contraption called an interocitor. He doesn't really know what any of the parts are. If 20 people had to create like these novel aircrafts whose mechanism of propulsion is not really understood even by like the top like aerospace scientists, and they had to just either follow the instructions really well to the best of their ability or believe the one guy that said he had a special relationship with the warehouse owner, such that if he ever starts to make his aircraft wrong, he will be flashed a discrete signal that only he can see. And so whoever copies his aircraft will be guaranteed to make theirs correctly if they copy his to the letter. If it was the case that everybody in that group looked at the instructions, scratched their head and said, you know what, I don't feel like I'm up to this, because, the task is their aircraft has to be safe enough to take them to Canada or something the next day. If they stressed out about it and said, I don't think I can do this, but they assumed that the task was possible and that their lives were not all about to be thrown away, then they would believe that person because there wouldn't really be another choice. And this person, I think in my previous presentation, I wrongly said that he's the Pope. He doesn't really clearly correspond to the Pope. He corresponds to the Catholic Church, and that signal corresponds to the sort of relationship that exists between God and the primatial leader of the Catholic Church at all times, such that the primatial leader is held, per Catholic doctrine, to be unable to bind the faithful to error. So that's a more sort of exact breakdown of the analogy. But the takeaway is that when theology is both difficult and important, the more important we suppose it to be, then the more plausible this person becomes. I mean, maybe at the end of the day, if their aircraft were not going to have to be put to any flight, but they were just going to be for exposition, like, hey, look at these cool things we built, then they would be like, yeah, whatever, I got this, I can figure the instructions out myself. But when it really counts, somehow that person becomes a lot more plausible, at least where we assume that the task is possible at all, which faith assumes, God has given us a not impossible task. Otherwise, the question of which church is the true church maybe just doesn't even matter, in which case the whole discussion is moot again. Let me see. It's like the scene in the movie Inception, where Ken Watanabe's character tells the main character, who is that, like Matt Damon or somebody? I don't remember. Or Brad Pitt. I get those two guys confused. Maybe it's not either of them. He tells him, I can take you to your destination, whatever impossible thing you need to do, I can do that for you. And the main character says, well, how do I know that you can? And Ken Watanabe says, you don't know, but I can, and you have no other choice. So that's sort of the logic of what's going on here. And so the more important we suppose theology to be, while acknowledging its difficulty, acknowledging that it's actually very, very difficult, maybe even more difficult than building an interocitor or building some kind of, weird aircraft, the more the sort of motivation for O-Star increases, while at the same time, it seems to me that there's this plasticity of plausibility that characterizes theology, where like basically any case is more or less equally plausible / implausible. Like at the end of the day, I don't really know that any set of facts determinately yields one conclusion or another. Like I don't think I would have ever, if you gave me all of theology to sort of reverse engineer, I don't think I would have ever, come away with the idea that God is three persons in one being. If I had to figure it all out on my own, it's profoundly confusing and counterintuitive, to say the least. So anyway, that's been my disjunctive argument for the Catholic Church. I think that one is justified in holding to Catholicism unless or until some case emerges that is like so decisive that we're forced to come to that conclusion despite the prior motivation for a proposition like O star. But I'm not aware of any such case. I think all the Catholic apologist needs to do against such a case is play defense and just cast doubt, which is in theology is not really that hard to do, because there's a critical way in which it seems to me the burden of proof is on the non-Catholic side, although ordinarily I don't like to use a phrase like the burden of proof, because growing up it's like I don't think I understood it. Not that I ever did debate or anything, but I didn't understand it because it seemed to me like it was a useless concept, because like it's that which by definition always rests on the other side. But in this case, if what I'm saying is correct about Catholicism and its ecclesiological principle consistently being one of submission rather than having to rely on your own personal theological acumen, and if what I'm saying is correct about it being plausible that God's omniness is such that it won't be the case that only a tiny minority of people can find the true church reliably, then I think it is the case that the non-Catholic side is in the position of having to meet this rather high burden of proof, one which I'm not sure can be met, one which at least I have not yet seen a case that can decisively meet it. As long as it's not decisively meeting that bar, the very sort of unclearness to me is an argument or an indication to decisively or determinately remain Catholic, and that would be my sort of grand argument for the Catholic Church, which really sort of works against every non-Catholic position. I'm calling it a disjunctive argument because a disjunction is an either or. So it's granting that we don't know which church is true, but we do know that at least it's true either Catholicism or not Catholicism. If not Catholicism, then there has to be more or less this easy way to find the true church just using the raw theological data. But there isn't such a way. So we have to reject non-Catholicism, and if you reject not Catholicism, that is equivalent to affirming Catholicism, or I suppose just being skeptical of everything. But if we're like these, every church or every position, but if we are otherwise sort of strong believers in Christ, and we believe out of faith that there is one correct church, then rejecting non-Catholicism will be equivalent to affirming Catholicism. So that's my argument in a nutshell. Hopefully it was relatively clear. Anybody who has thoughts, opinions, feedback is welcome to share it in the comments. Just thank you for watching and listening. Sorry I didn't have any slides. I may in the future make another presentation where I have slides, especially if I find a more sort of clear or concise or powerful way to present this presentation and this line of argument, which I do find pretty convincing. I find it pretty personally convincing. There could be a flaw in it that I haven't discovered yet. So if you think there is one, again, I would like to see your thoughts or hear your thoughts. All right. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you.